When people first hear the phrase Microsoft's Linux Mint 23 Nova, they usually pause. Some laugh, some get confused, as some think it's clickbait. And that reaction alone tells you something powerful about the moment we're living in. For decades, Microsoft and Linux were painted as opposites, even rivals locked in an ideological battle between proprietary control and open-source freedom. So when a title like this starts circulating, it forces a bigger question. Has the world of desktop computing shifted so dramatically that the lines between Windows and Linux are no longer what they used to be? And more importantly, does Linux Mint 23 Nova represent a future that even Microsoft can't ignore? Let's be clear from the start. Linux Mint is not owned or developed by Microsoft. It's an independent, community-driven Linux distribution built on Ubuntu, which itself is based on Debian. But the reason people associate Mint with Microsoft in headlines like this is because something deeper is happening. The traditional dominance of Windows on the desktop is being challenged not through direct confrontation but through evolution. Linux Mint 23 Nova isn't just another Linux release. It symbolizes a convergence of ideas, expectations, and user experience philosophies that once belonged exclusively to Windows. For years, Windows succeeded because it was familiar, was pre-installed, it was compatible with everything, was the default choice. Meanwhile, Linux was perceived as technical, intimidating, or for programmers only. That perception has been slowly dismantled over the past decade. Distributions like Linux Mint focused on solving a simple but critical problem. How do you make Linux feel comfortable for someone who has used Windows their entire life? Mint answered that question with the Cinnamon desktop environment, a layout that feels instantly recognizable, taskbar at the bottom, a start-style menu, system tray icons, window controls where you expect them, no radical reinvention, no forced design experiments, just familiarity done right. Linux Mint 23. Nova takes that philosophy and refines it to a level that genuinely competes with modern Windows releases. Performance is leaner. Boot times are faster.
Background resource usage is dramatically lower compared to Windows 10, and especially Windows 10 and especially Windows.
Mint feels responsive in a way that reminds users what computing used to feel like before telemetry services. Background sync engines and aggressive update systems consume system resources. This isn't just about speed, it's about control. One of the biggest criticisms of modern Windows is the loss of user autonomy. Automatic updates at inconvenient times. Forced reboots, integrated ads in the start menu, count requirements tied to cloud services. Linux Mint 23 Nova stands in direct contrast to that model. Updates are transparent. You choose when to install them. You see exactly what's changing. There is no hidden advertising layer. There's no corporate account requirement to use your own machine. That difference might sound small, but psychologically it is massive. It shifts the relationship between the user and the operating system from dependency to ownership. Security is another pillar where perceptions have shifted. Windows has improved significantly over the years, integrating Defender, Secure Boot, and hardware-based protections. But Linux has always had a strong security foundation built into its architecture. Linux Mint 23 Nova benefits from the mature Linux kernel, long-term support repositories, and a permission model that reduces the risk of system-wide damage from malicious software. Combined with the lower market share that makes it a less attractive target for widespread malware campaigns, Mint offers an experience that feels safer by design, rather than protected by layers of reactive software. Compatibility used to be Linux's weak point. If you relied on specific Windows applications, you were stuck. But the landscape has changed. Web applications now dominate productivity workflows. Microsoft Office runs in the browser. Google Docs is platform agnostic. Slack, Discord, Zoom, and countless collaboration tools are web-based or have Linux clients. For creative professionals, tools like Blender, Krita, and DaVinci Resolve offer native Linux support. For gamers, Steam's Proton compatibility layer has revolutionized expectations. Thousands of Windows games now run on Linux with minimal configuration. Linux Mint 23 Nova inherits all of these advances. What was once experimental is now routine. And this is where the Microsoft angle becomes interesting. Microsoft itself has embraced Linux in ways that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. The Windows subsystem for Linux allows developers to run Linux environments directly inside Windows. Azure, Microsoft's cloud platform, runs a massive percentage of Linux workloads. SQL Server and .NET have Linux versions. Microsoft is no longer fighting Linux. It's building on top of it. That shift changes the competitive dynamic. It's no longer Windows versus Linux. It's about ecosystems, services, and user trust. Linux Mint 23 Nova enters this landscape not as a rebel alternative, but as a polished, mature desktop operating system that can realistically replace Windows for a large segment of users. Students who need a reliable machine for browsing, writing, and research. Developers who prefer native Linux tooling. Businesses that want stable, long-term support without licensing fees. Even casual home users who are tired of forced design changes and hardware requirements that make older machines obsolete. Speaking of hardware requirements, this is another area where Mint changes the narrative. Windows 11 introduced strict requirements like TPM 2.0 and specific CPU generations. Many perfectly functional PCs were suddenly labeled unsupported. Linux Mint 23 Nova runs comfortably on hardware that Windows 11 refuses to install on. This extends the life of millions of devices worldwide. In regions where purchasing new hardware is not financially trivial, that matters. In environmental terms, reducing electronic waste matters even more. An operating system that breathes new life into aging hardware is not just convenient, it's sustainable. User interface design in Mint 23 Nova reflects a maturity that avoids extremes. It doesn't chase minimalism to the point of hiding functionality. It doesn't overload the screen with widgets. It provides customization without overwhelming the user. Themes, panel layouts, icon packs, and applets can be modified easily, but nothing forces you to change anything. It works out of the box. That balance between flexibility and simplicity is something Windows has struggled with in recent redesigns, where legacy control panels coexist with modern settings apps, creating a fragmented experience. Software management in Mint is another quiet revolution. Software Manager presents curated applications in an accessible format. Flatpak integration expands the library dramatically while maintaining sandboxing for security. Installation is typically one click. Updates are centralized. Drivers are managed through a straightforward interface. For someone transitioning from Windows, this feels less like learning a new operating system and more like discovering a cleaner version of what they already know. There is also the philosophical shift toward privacy. Modern computing increasingly revolves around data collection. Linux Mint's approach is refreshingly minimal. There's no built-in telemetry harvesting user behavior for targeted ads. There are no background processes constantly syncing personal activity to a corporate cloud unless the user explicitly chooses to use such services. In a world where privacy concerns grow yearly, that transparency builds trust. Of course, no operating system is perfect. Certain specialized professional software still lacks native Linux support. Some hardware manufacturers provide limited driver optimization compared to Windows. Enterprise environments deeply tied to Active Directory infrastructures may face integration challenges. But the number of users affected by these limitations shrinks each year as cross-platform development becomes standard practice. What makes Linux Mint 23 Nova feel like a turning point is not a single feature. It's the culmination of incremental improvements across performance, usability, compatibility, and philosophy. It represents the idea that desktop computing doesn't have to be dictated by one corporation's roadmap. It demonstrates that community-driven software can achieve polish without sacrificing openness. It challenges the assumption that switching operating systems must be painful. In many ways, the future of desktop computing isn't about replacing Windows with Linux in a dramatic overthrow. It's about choice becoming viable. For the first time, a Windows user can download Mint, create a bootable USB, install it in under an hour, and realistically use it as their primary system without feeling like they stepped into a science experiment. That accessibility changes everything. The psychological barrier is collapsing. When users realize they can keep their workflow, access their files, browse the web, join meetings, play games, and customize their environment without paying for licenses or surrendering control, the conversation shifts. It stops being, "Why would I leave Windows?" It becomes, "Why wouldn't I try something different?" Microsoft understands this shift. It's why its strategy increasingly revolves around services rather than operating system lock-in. Office 365, OneDrive, Teams. As these generate recurring revenue regardless of the underlying OS. In that sense, Linux Mint 23 Nova doesn't threaten Microsoft the way Linux once did. Instead, it redefines competition at the desktop level. The operating system becomes a platform for services rather than the primary revenue engine. For developers, Mint provides a native Unix-like environment without the abstraction layers required on Windows. Package managers, terminal workflows, scripting environments, and containerization tools feel natural. For power users, the ability to inspect logs, tweak configurations, and understand exactly what the system is doing builds confidence. Transparency fosters mastery. For everyday users, stability matters more than ideology. Mint's long-term support model ensures security updates for years. Major version upgrades are optional and manageable. There are no surprise interface overhauls that radically alter daily habits overnight. Consistency builds loyalty. So why frame this as Microsoft's Linux Mint 23 Nova changing everything? Because the boundaries between ecosystems are dissolving. Microsoft runs Linux in its cloud. Developers build cross-platform applications by default. Web technologies abstract away operating system differences. In that environment, the dominance of any single desktop OS becomes less inevitable. Linux Mint 23 Nova symbolizes a desktop future where performance efficiency, user control, privacy respect, and sustainable hardware usage are prioritized. It shows that the mainstream desktop experience can be lightweight without being limited, customizable without being chaotic, secure without being intrusive. The real revolution isn't loud, it's subtle. It's a user installing Mint on an old laptop and realizing it feels new again. It's a student discovering they can complete their entire degree without paying for an operating system license. It's a small business reducing costs while maintaining stability. It's a gamer launching titles on Linux without tweaking obscure settings. These incremental shifts accumulate. Desktop computing is no longer about one company dictating standards. It's about ecosystems coexisting. Linux Mint 23 Nova doesn't need to defeat Windows to change everything. It only needs to prove that a polished, user-friendly, open alternative can stand confidently beside it. Once that proof becomes widely recognized, the power dynamic transforms. The future of desktop computing will likely be hybrid, flexible, and user-driven. Some will stay with Windows for specific professional tools. Others will migrate to Linux for autonomy and efficiency. Many will dual boot or run multiple systems depending on tasks. What matters is that the monopoly mindset fades. Linux Mint 23 Nova represents that shift more clearly than ever before. It's not about rebellion, it's about readiness. The Linux desktop is no longer preparing to compete. It is competing. And for millions of users, it's already enough. In the end, the phrase Microsoft's Linux Mint might be technically inaccurate, but symbolically, it captures a profound reality. The era of strict rivalry has evolved into an era of convergence. Open source and proprietary platforms intersect daily. Services transcend operating systems. Users have more power than ever. And that is why Linux Mint 23 Nova changes everything. It's not because it introduces a single groundbreaking feature, but because it proves that the future of desktop computing is defined by choice, efficiency, privacy, and control. The operating system is no longer the cage, it's the foundation. And for the first time in decades, that foundation truly belongs to the user.